Good evening, everybody. Good evening. We are going to begin our pre-meeting that starts at 5:30, which is a discussion of residential parking and valet parking ordinances. Ms. Sleep?
Yes, good evening, Board. You all had asked that I prepare a presentation to briefly go over some ordinance options, one being a residential parking program ordinance, and the second being a valet parking ordinance. So we are going to briefly overview those two options. So just to start off, I wanted to provide the authority for parking regulation. That would be 160A301 that allows the town to regulate both on-street and off-street parking within the town. Also, there is a U.S. Supreme Court case that has upheld the constitutional validity of controlled parking regulations in residential areas. So the first option, as I mentioned, is a residential parking program. And what that would allow for is the town to regulate who can park in a residential parking zone once it has been established. Most of the jurisdictions that we surveyed as an initial step of creating a residential parking zone opted to require a study be performed, and that study is to determine the feasibility and desirability for a proposed residential parking zone within a specified residential area. The ordinance may provide that the study could be initiated or requested by citizens and/or initiated at the governing board's own initiative. The study would include a variety of factors that we would have to determine in our ordinance when we created it, and criteria for consideration in determining whether or not the proposed parking zone should be created and is appropriate. Some of the initial and preliminary considerations related to this step that I noted in my research would be who can submit the application requesting the study. As I mentioned, it could be at the citizen's request and/or at the board's own prerogative or initiative. Also, should it be the same threshold for submitting a petition for establishing the zone, which we will discuss on the next slide, as the zone cannot be created with the requisite petition signatures without the request. So what I mean by that is, if we are going to have the study performed, should we require the same number of signatures to request that the study be performed as the number of signatures that we require for the petition to create the zone? Because if you are going to expend funds to actually perform the study, but then you don't have buy-in from the residents within the zone, does it make sense to spend the money, expend the effort on establishing the feasibility study in the first place? So those are some initial considerations. Also, who would be performing this study? Would this be done in-house by the Engineering and Public Works Department, or would it need to be contracted out? I don't know what the cost of such a study would be if we did contract it out, but that's also a preliminary consideration. Also, another thought, should we include a cost for submitting a request that the study be performed to help cover the initial cost of the study? Most of the jurisdictions that we researched did require a cost for the petition to be submitted, but should we also require a cost for the study to be performed? Another thought, too, at this step is how long will it take to actually perform the study? That would need to be factored into the timeline as to how long it would take to actually establish a zone. The initial zone that is created would likely take the longest, as it would be our first zone that we establish. So once the study is complete, and if the criteria that we come up with in the ordinance are satisfied for warranting the creation of a parking zone, that's when petitions may be submitted. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, we would have to consider whether or not we wanted the same number of persons that we require to submit the petition to sign off on the initial study as well. So just to put it in perspective, Raleigh, in their ordinance, they require that the petition be signed by 70% of households eligible for a residential parking permit within the proposed zone. Durham, on the other hand, requires that the petition be signed by a majority of the residents on lots abutting the proposed parking zone. Charlotte, which is a little bit closer to where we are located, requires that the petition be signed by 75% of households within the proposed parking zone. So considerations at this step would be that we would need to develop a petition form. We would also need to have a verification process for signatures. And what I mean by that is how will we make sure that we are actually getting the requisite number of signatures and that the signatures are coming from residents within the proposed zone. We would need a mechanism to verify that those signatures are what we think that they are. And again, cost. As I mentioned, there would be a cost associated with performing the study, but there would also be a cost associated with the petition, the verification of the signatures, and also the implementation of the zone should it be created. That would have to be factored into the overall cost of the program. After a petition is submitted with the requisite number of signatures, the governing body may designate the residential parking zone if the petition is submitted and approved. So we would need signage demarking the designated parking zone and describing what the restrictions are for that zone. The town's official traffic map would also have to be updated. That traffic map is currently housed within the town clerk's office, and it is overseen by the engineering department. We would need to make this information available online as well and likely have a social media campaign and other outlets that we would want to push this information to citizens so that they would understand that there is a new zone in place. So questions at this stage, once we are ready to initiate a zone, would be who is going to take care of the signs? I assume that would be our engineering and public works department as well once the signs are created. There would be a cost for creating the signs and also installing them in the necessary spots. So if the board did decide to create a parking zone and it is established, each resident within the parking zone must apply for and pay for an annual permit to park within the zone. Most of the jurisdictions that we researched did require separate vehicles to require a separate permit, meaning that one household could not get essentially a permit for their entire household. So if they have 5 vehicles within the household, they would need a parking permit for each vehicle. We did look to see what options there were for establishing and displaying the permits once you have paid for them. Most of the jurisdictions initially utilized decal stickers, meaning that they would, if paid for and approved, have a sticker that they affixed to their vehicle in a designated spot, whether it be the windshield, the back of the vehicle, et cetera. However, in further researching this issue and this aspect of this program, we noted that most of the jurisdictions have switched over to a license plate reader system instead of having the decals. I don't know if that's because the decals were being moved around to different vehicles, but the license plate reader system seems to be the predominant method at this point in time for jurisdictions that do have these types of programs. And that, again, is something that we would have to research, get cost estimates for, because I don't know what a license plate reader system of this nature would cost. I don't know how long it would take to implement. That would be something that I would have to enlist HPD to help advise on and see how that would work from a feasibility standpoint. We also have to consider if we do establish this program, not only how would we read or request that the permits be displayed, but we'd have to think about oversight options, oversight of the permitting program. Is that going to be something that we ask HPD to do? Is that going to be something that we ask the town manager's office to do? Would that be an additional duty of the engineering and public works department? Would this be something that we contract out? Will we create a new department for this permitting process? These are all things that we would have to think about. And again, those costs that we factor in, not only for the study, but the maintenance of the program, the oversight of the program, the signs that we need, we would have to factor all of those costs in to make sure that we are covering the town's cost of implementing such a program. And also, for the larger jurisdictions, we did note that some of them have a designated director or even a department that handles this matter for them. And looking at my notes, we had recommended that the permits be renewed annually to help with the overall cost and oversight that we will continue to see not only upon the initial installation of the program and the initial cost of the equipment that we may need, but over time to cover all these other costs that I said we would experience. So that is the gist of the residential parking program, aside from the last slide. The last slide here talks about enforcement. What are enforcement options? That is to say, if someone did park in a spot that was part of the residential parking program, a zone that we have created, what would be our enforcement options? Most of the jurisdictions that we researched utilized civil penalties, meaning that if there was someone parked within the zone, especially for repeat offenders that are parking in the zone without a permit, they would issue a civil penalty. That is not to say that is the only option for enforcement, but that was the option that we saw that was most utilized. We also had wanted to put one more additional note in regarding the ordinance before we move on to the other option of a valet parking ordinance. And that would be that we would want to consider exceptions possibly for certain times, such as when there may be a large event that is taking place near or surrounding the proposed parking zone. We may decide that in that instance, we want to have an exemption that you could park at least temporarily within the zone, even if you don't have a parking permit, to alleviate stress of parking being limited on that particular day or time. We also wanted to add in some exceptions for emergency vehicles to park in those spots when necessary, even if they don't have a permit, of course, so that they could handle emergency matters. That is all we had on the overview for the residential parking program. I know that that was very brief. We kept it brief purposely because there are a lot of details that we do not yet have, and we wanted to just get initial feedback as to whether or not this would be something that the board would be interested in. If so, we could do additional research and get some cost estimates, but I'm happy to answer any questions that I can answer at this time related to this type of residential parking program.
Commissioner Walsh?
And this may be a little granular, regardless of the percentage, if it was 75% of the household, is that the owners of the household, say if I'm renting, or let's suppose I want a parking permit, but my wife says, I don't like the program. I mean, how do we get to that 75%? Because that's a lot of work. I mean, you're not going to get 75% of people to believe it's sunny out right now. So
That's a good question. And if you wouldn't mind going back to that slide that had those percentages on it as to the signatures required for the petition. So I wanted to note that the wording is slightly different for each jurisdiction that we used as an example. Raleigh requires the petition be signed by 70% of households, and I don't necessarily have their ordinance pulled up. I would assume that they have created a definition for household as to what household actually means within the ordinance definitions. And Durham, theirs is a little unique because, as you can see, it talked about residents on lots abutting the proposed parking zone. I don't know if that's because where most of their zones are located in Durham, but I would think that we would want to make sure that we are getting buy-in from those who would be subject to the zone requirements. And to do that, I would recommend focusing on those residents within the zone. As to your question about ownership versus renting, we could put a stipulation, or I guess a requirement in the ordinance that said that the owners would qualify for a permit and then their renter could get the permit if the owner qualified. There are different ways to wordsmith that as to, how you guys so chose to verify who's signing off on the petition. But the biggest thing is getting buy-in from the residents and the owners of property within the proposed zone that will be subject to the regulations. Most of the jurisdictions did not allow eligibility for a parking permit within the zone unless you actually either owned property or lived within the proposed zone.
This is also pretty granular. How does it work for guests of these households after a zone is determined?
Some of the options that you would have for guests would be that temporary authorization. So if we made an exception for temporary parking, let's say maybe 1 hour without having a permit in place, not all of the jurisdictions included the temporary option, but it's something that we could include if we wanted to address the guest parking situation.
Well, actually, that was one of my questions, so that is something I'm also interested in, and, how that would look for maybe homes and residents that don't necessarily want a permit for their own vehicles because they have a driveway, garage, et cetera, but might want one for a visitor, and that visitor, if it changes and it's not always the same person, I'd be curious how that would look. Okay. It's on. My other question is, if we're looking at zones where it might not encompass a whole neighborhood, but there's a clubhouse or another amenity within the zone that's being looked at, how that would work for residents that might visit the amenity, the clubhouse, the pool, playground, whatnot, but not physically have their home within a zone. Do you know?
And that depends too as to whether or not the location of the amenity is within an area that we can regulate. We can't regulate private property or private streets. So if it is within public property, public streets, public right-of-way, that would factor in. But a lot of apartment complexes, for example, they already require some sort of decal or some sort of parking authorization to access their amenity. I know a lot of pools, for example, have gates around them. And so unless you have a parking, I don't know the correct name for it, but something that's similar to, the transponder that you may have for the tolls, a lot of them have access to the gated area because of a transponder or something else that the community has provided. So we would have to look into that as well when crafting the ordinance and the ordinance requirements.
And just the last thing, and I don't know, maybe it's too early for this, but I would be curious from staff if this is something you feel that we could do in-house or would require outside consultants on.
To be honest with you, Emily and I hadn't discussed it much past the research, so I haven't talked to Stephen or HPD until we get some feedback from you, kind of where you're thinking, and then we would flesh that out.
And so for now, while you all are mulling that information over related to the residential parking program, we'll move on to the next topic, which is the valet parking ordinance. And the information that I have to share on this type of ordinance is much briefer. Certain jurisdictions require that valet parking services must be permitted in order to operate. And so in order to operate, the valet parking ordinance requires submission of a permit application and payment of a permit fee. Most of the ordinances that we surveyed contain certain criteria that must be satisfied in order to be eligible for a valet parking permit for that particular service to operate. And the valet parking permits are typically enforced via civil penalties as well. While not as comprehensive in terms of all of the different steps. You would have to establish criteria, and those criteria should be as objective as possible for when determining it would be appropriate to provide or be eligible for a valet parking permit. Some of the things that the other ordinances looked at is where would the location for the cars that were parked by valet be located? Would it be impeding traffic, whether it be vehicular traffic, pedestrian traffic, et cetera? Is the right-of-way going to be blocked at any point in time by the cars that are parked via the valet parking service? Those are things that we would want to look at when crafting the criteria for the ordinance, as we would want the ordinance to be able to be applied equitably to all of the applicants that are applying for a valet parking permit to operate that type of service. I would assume that the permitting and enforcement would be handled in this instance, in this type of ordinance, by HPD. However, if we were to move forward with both ordinances, a residential parking program ordinance and a valet parking ordinance, that again may need to be a factor that we consider. Who is overseeing the permitting, especially if we're adding 2 new permits versus just one or the other. And again, we would want to make sure that we create standardized forms for the application process. Most of the jurisdictions accept in-person applications, but almost all of them not only accepted in-person applications, but had an online application system in place that we would need to create for our own website. And again, we would want to push out information related to this ordinance to let businesses know that we are now requiring a permit to operate valet parking services. So that one, again, much briefer, not as many steps, not as much of an information dump, but happy to answer any questions that you may have. Charlotte does have a valet parking permit ordinance, and they do require that those certain criteria, such as not blocking the flow of traffic, be in place to be eligible. Also, I believe that they reserve the right within their ordinance, I may be misspeaking, so don't hold me to it, to suspend valet parking services on specific days. So if they had parades or festivals, they can require that the permittee stop temporarily the valet parking services on that specific day.
Commissioner Walsh?
I would say initially, a valet parking service or a valet parking ordinance would be a lot easier to bite off and do if we need to. So if for the existing businesses that use valet services, they don't have some grandfather clause that would preclude them from being under that new ordinance, assuming that we adopted one.
No. So if we adopt the ordinance, it will apply equally within the town limits. And all valet services that are in operation would require an application to be made to the town approval and pay the application fee for the permit.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is a little granular as well, but would this still apply if, say, there was a wedding and someone had a valet hired just for the wedding for the evening? Would they still be required to go through this?
So the ordinances that we saw were more so for ongoing services, not necessarily single-day services. So meaning that services that were offered by a business, usually a restaurant or something of that nature, possibly a hotel. But as far as carving out exceptions, that's something that we can do in the ordinance. So if it was for a special event, such as a wedding or a birthday family reunion, we could include exception language as long as it was a temporary service that was being provided.
Any other questions?
Okay, thank you. And if you do have any additional questions, feel free to send Jacob and/or myself an email. We'll be happy to try to respond. If the board does decide that they would like to move forward with getting cost estimates, we can do that to further vet these ordinance options out.
Thank you so much for that information and research. We appreciate it. We will convene our regular meeting at 6 p.m., so that's 5 minutes. So board get your water,